Hello and welcome to my presentation. My recent doctoral research has focused on exploring historical tuba-composer relationships, investigating how contemporary performance practice can be critically reflected upon regarding choices made when interpreting music of the past. Music of the mid to late Romantic era still often lacks such an approach, and the fact that this time period coincides with the moment when members of the tuba family begin to enter the orchestra is not without causal connection. The lack of symbiotic relationships between tubists and composers is deeply problematic with regard to the music of today, and issues similarly arise as soon as ensembles interested in critical performance practice begin to employ members of the tuba family. As typical examples, one can observe these concerts by the Orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment performing Wagner's Das Rheingold and Verdi's Requiem. Included are 19th-century bass trumpets and valve trombones, yet the instruments of the tuba family used in both cases are of mid to late 20th century design. I've been recording excerpts from works including tuba family members on historical instruments so that each individual musician can make informed decisions regarding choice of instrument, articulation, dynamic and timbre, or any other parameter that an interpreter might wish to consider. As a case study, I will focus here on certainly the most influential composer for the tuba, Richard Wagner. Wagner's first mature opera Rienzi employs both a serpent and an ophicleide, this choice being a result of geography. Although first performed in Dresden in 1842, Wagner wrote Rienzi in Paris between 1838 and 40, where the ophicleide had been used at the opera since 1819. By the late 18th century, the serpent had been adapted into various forms for use in marching and military bands, and had begun to gain some limited traction in the orchestra, although rarely being specified by name. For example, here is a quote-unquote serpent part for Mozart's Hafner Symphony, used in early performances of the work by the Société de Concert in Lille. In a similar manner, Franz Ludwig Schubert makes this remarkable statement in 1862: "The wonderful effect of the serpent in Beethoven's Fidelio is well known." In both cases here, the serpent is being used as a substitute for the bassoon or contrabassoon, an instrument it was paired with in the few works that did specify its employment, such as Mendelssohn's Reformation Symphony and his oratorio Paulus. As acoustician Murray Campbell pointed out using these frequency spectrum charts, while the contrabassoon may have fundamental pitches an octave lower than the serpent is in fact much more effective at producing low-frequency energy. The range of this part is, however, puzzling, with Wagner's writing for the instrument going noticeably lower than what most players could have managed. One possible explanation for this is due to French ton de chapelle being roughly 2 semitones below the ton d'orchestre in the early 19th century, hence why Berlioz, in his instrumentation treaty of 1843, declared the serpent to be an instrument in B-flat. This would make the low B-flat and B natural written here simple to play, rather than being very difficult using the commonly found non-transposing instrument. Berlioz's famous description of the serpent's tone as raw and barbaric was also perhaps a misnomer. In 1865, Schubert wrote that, if he had actually heard a good serpent player in Germany, he would probably have formed a very different opinion. Whether or not Wagner was able to engage one of these good German serpent players for the premiere of Rienzi in Dresden in October 1842 is not clear. When translating the names of instruments on the manuscript of his Faust overture for the first performance in the following season, he changes serpent to bass tuba. This famous opening soli passage down to a low G sharp is now only possible using Berlioz's hypothetical B-flat serpent. Given the practice of employing military bandsmen for extra brass, it's quite possible that the serpent part would have been performed using a form of upright serpent or basson russe, although this recording uses a more traditional serpent ordinaire. In Die Fliegende Holländer, Wagner writes for a notably smaller orchestra, removing the serpent but keeping the ophicleide. Premiered 3 months after Rienzi in January 1843, it is similarly unclear as to what instrument would have been used at the time, perhaps a new bass tuba, but also plausibly one form of ophicleide, such as the examples of northern German instruments from around this period shown here, one in the traditional French keyed style, the other a valved ophicleide, which first emerged in Vienna in 1829. The instrument name was changed in a version printed in 1860, although it's worthy of note here that the difference between contemporaneous bass tubas and ophicleides was not necessarily so great. The ophicleide shown here on the right, made in around 1860 in Manchester, has a bell diameter of 242 mm, 49 mm larger than that of the original Moritz bass tuba shown on the left. Keyed ophicleides, however, do generally have notably lower brightness potential parameter figures, and therefore a darker sound than most tubas and valved ophicleides. This sound, rich in lower harmonics, can hopefully be heard in the following excerpts. Tannhäuser is the first major work written specifically with a bass tuba in mind, although the part still fits the range of an ophicleide. Gottfried Hinke played in the 1845 Dresden premiere on a tuba, although in the original part the abbreviation Officle has been added in pencil. In 1846, Wagner recommended that a tuba player be hired by the orchestra in Dresden that can also play double bass, suggesting that this player must without a doubt earn an extra 50 thalers per year because he has two instruments to play, and to main the necessary energy he requires the best possible nourishment. In Lohengrin, begun in the same year, he writes below an A1, thereby creating a part that can only be performed using a bass tuba. These excerpts are performed using this Swedish tuba from around 1860, being notable how the instrument had already begun to grow in size and indeed spread across Europe. After the premiere of Lohengrin, Wagner begins composition of Der Ring des Nibelungen, and here's where Wagner's relationship with the tuba family becomes particularly complicated. For context, here is an outline of the 23-year period between Wagner's initial sketches and the Bayreuth premiere of the complete cycle. A critical examination of Wagner's tuba parts has, to date, been somewhat overshadowed by extensive discussion of the Wagner tuba. In every study of Wagner's brass orchestration of the Ring, from Oskar Franz's article in the Zeitschrift für Instrumentenbau in 1884 through to detailed studies from Egon Voss and Kurt von Westenhagen, the regular tuba is partially or completely overlooked in favour of these horn-related tubas. Further research is also needed to substantiate a theory from Frendar Overton, who suggested that with these instruments, Wagner was attempting to recreate the sonority of the serpent that by the 1850s had generally fallen out of common practice. Wagner wrote to his patron, King Ludwig II, in 1865 that he included instruments in the Ring that he first came across at the workshop of Adolf Sachs, von Westenhagen concluding that this must have taken place during Wagner's visit to Paris shortly before commencing composition of Rheingold in 1853. This is supported by Peter Nitscher's study of the initial sketches for Das Rheingold, where Wagner mentions one Saxon contrabass in E-flat. That would refer to the instrument here on the left, the other Saxon bass and Saxon baryton inspiring the Wagner tubas. By the fifth page, this became CB tube, as was to remain on the final score. In an 1862 letter regarding the upcoming concert of Rheingold and Walküre excerpts, Wagner refers to the instrument as a contrabass tuba in E-flat, suggesting that this and the higher tubas could be found in the Austrian military bands, although perhaps under different names. In the parts made for these performances, the instrument is described as a bombardon, a word with many meanings, but as a general rule used to describe generic lower brass instruments with valves, particularly those used in military bands. This part would have been performed by the Wiener Philharmonic's Bombardonbläser Franz Fretzer using his new tuba/Hellingkon in C mit 4 Zindelen, acquired in June 1862. This instrument is likely to be similar to the Helicon pictured on the left here, built in Vienna in around 1850. The widespread terminological confusion, however, can be demonstrated by comparing this instrument with these two other very different instruments under the name Kontrabass tuba from similar periods and similar locations in the same collection at the Germanisches Nationalmuseum. The Hofopfernorchester in Munich purchased a bass tuba for the premiere of Tristan und Isolde in 1865 from Karl Wilhelm Moritz in Berlin, son of Johann Gottfried Moritz, who had invented the bass tuba together with Wilhelm Wieprecht in 1835. Later that season, chief conductor Hans von Bülow contacted Wieprecht, asking him to construct the new brass instruments required for the upcoming premiere of Das Rheingold. At first, Wieprecht suggests either a bass contra tuba in E-flat with 6 valves, or a contrabass tuba in contra F tube length, twice as long as the common bass tuba with 5 valves. He believes that the latter would constitute an instrumental colossus, exceeding even the so-called low B-flat basses commonly found in Austria, which are almost invincible to the strength of human lungs. Finances, it seems, got in the way of ordering the recommended E-flat tuba. Von Bülow suggested sending back the tuba they had bought for Tristan so that an extra valve could be added, but Moritz replied that this would not solve the problem. Quote, since it is not set up for this purpose, its tubes and bell construction were not made anywhere near wide enough to give room for development of a longer air passage enabled by the 6th valve. The tone would therefore always sound small and without definition. Therefore, in order to be able to produce a powerful tone that speaks easily, an instrument is required which, if permitted, I would send for inspection. This instrument is in low B-flat and contains all contrabass notes with an easy response at a powerful volume. Unfortunately, there is no more extant communication between the two parties. Von Bülow soon left the project, and there are no records of instruments that might indeed have been shipped to Munich. An Offerkleed bass tuba bläser was engaged from 1869, but there is no indication of whether they played in these performances, or if a member of the Münchner Regimentskapelle had been employed. Importantly, in this piece by Wilhelm Altenberg, celebrating the centenary of the Moritz factory, reference is made to production of the bass trumpet and contrabass trombone for these performances, but nothing regarding a contrabass tuba. Speculation regarding what instrument could have been used often focuses on instruments made by the Bohemian manufacturer Václav František Červený. Červený is noted for recognizing, as Moritz pointed out earlier, that a wide bore size is needed to create strong, low fundamental sound, such as in his instrument here on the right. Low Bavarian instruments of the time, such as these other two, are known as Halbinstrumenter, meaning that their bore is narrow enough to inhibit production of the lowest fundamentals, a problem that also affected Sachs's early contrabass sax horns that Wagner might have heard in 1853. Therefore, these instruments cannot play fully resonant notes as low as Moritz's F-tuba, despite having an overall tube length almost a metre longer. Červený continued this Moritz-style Ganzinstrumenter with longer tube lengths. To quote one of ubiquitous sources, Clifford Bevan writes that Červený is generally credited with invention of the contrabass tuba in C in 1845, going so far as to say that Wagner specified it from Das Rheingold onwards. However, no contemporary commentators mention creation of a contrabass tuba at this time. Červený himself in 1872 calls it a contrabass, an instrument in the form of a bombardon tuba in contra F and C. The instrument is not clearly illustrated in any publication. In contemporaneous exhibition catalogues, focus is rather directed on Červeny's Ganzinstrumenter of tenor bass size, the Baroxyton and Cornon. This contrabass is perhaps the instrument to which Wieprecht was referring to in his letter quoted above regarding the instrumental colossi found in Austria. No surviving examples of any of the instruments illustrated here have been found, so perhaps none of them were ever produced on a large scale. As an example of persistent misinformation, this serpent bombardon in F can be found in Friedrich Samener's contemporaneous work, yet he refers to it as a bass Offerkleed in contra B flat, a description lacking in both acoustic and organological reasoning. In 1884, Červený patented the Kaiserbass, an instrument which forms the genesis of many contrabass tubas used and built today, but it's important not to confuse this instrument with any from 30 or 40 years earlier. What is certain is that neither instrument was specified by Wagner in Das Rheingold. There's no evidence of direct communication between the two men, as opposed to Wagner's numerous documented exchanges with both Sachs and Wieprecht. By May of 1870, Wagner was asking Hans Richter to help arrange the extra brass instruments needed for Bayreuth. In 1873, he contacted his publishers Franz Schott regarding changes to transpositions, writing that the contrabass tuba is to be transposed to C, as it has been performed so far. C3 in the original score will sound as E-flat 2. He was therefore seemingly aware of the C helicon used by Fretzer in 1862, but perhaps he is also accepting that the tubist will use whatever instrument they choose and do any transposition themselves, a practice that continues to this day. In his role organising the extra brass instruments for Bayreuth, Richter hires Otto Waldemar Brooks in 1875 for the first rehearsal period. In September of that year, he took over from Fretzer at the Wiener Hofopfernorchester, and on the 4th of October, the opera ordered a new tuba for him. This is likely to be very similar to this 5-valve tuba made by Leopold Ullmann in around 1875. In this letter to instrument maker Wilhelm Heckel from 1894, opera director Wilhelm Jahn writes that in the Wagnerian works there is one 5-valved contrabass tuba tuned in F with a register from C1 to C5, usable register as far as F4. This range is identical to that described by Wieprecht in the original 1835 bass tuba patent shown here. Wieprecht described it as a dual bass and contrabass instrument, but under the name of bass tuba, as Wagner had also previously described it, and indeed did so afterwards in Parsifal. The question therefore arises as to why the ring consistently refers to a contrabass tuba. There are several plausible explanations. It is of course probable that after deciding to transpose the part to concert pitch, Wagner gave little thought anymore to the actual instrument being used at all. In any case, a Viennese tradition was established using this form of F-tuba, which continued until at least 1911, when Emil Hartmann, who also always referred to his now 6-valved F-tuba as a contrabass tuba, played at Bayreuth for the final time. It's striking to compare this instrument with those in B-flat and C now commonly described as contrabass tubas. Shown here are typical instruments used today in performances of the ring, in the middle an instrument in B-flat commonly used in Germany, and on the left a model in C found more frequently in the rest of the world. Unfortunately, I've so far been able to access a Wiener tuba under current lockdown conditions to make recordings. In the meantime, however, here's a recording using this Bavarian instrument on the right from around 1870, of the famous Wurm solo from Das Rheingold. This contrabass tuba practice extends further than the music of Wagner himself. Benjamin Gunnar Kors has argued that Bruckner specified contrabass tuba only to avoid confusion with the Wagner tubas. Mahler worked with the aforementioned Emil Hartmann in both Berlin and Vienna around the time of the premiere of his Second Symphony. His other symphonies all only mention bass tuba, despite some later editions changing this, albeit inconsistently, to contrabass tuba. Schoenberg provides a puzzling example with Gurre-Lieder where the part seems to swap between bass and contrabass tuba. There are many possible reasons for this, but most notably in all of Schoenberg's listing of the instrumentation of the work, from the earlier sketches through to the final published score with all instrumental doublings. As seen here, he only ever includes some spelling of contrabass tuba, bass tuba only being mentioned specifically in modern editions. I'm looking to investigate more connections between tubists and composers and search for further representative examples of instruments in working order. For example, when organising Wagner's concerts in England in 1877, Hans Richter ordered a tuba from Irish manufacturer William Hilliard, which became the blueprint for the English F-tuba written for by Elgar, Holst, Vaughan Williams and many more. Recordings on this instrument and many others can be found via my website, with more being added soon. Many thanks for listening, and I look forward to your questions and comments.